Somewhere in the darkness of a farmhouse bedroom, a match scrapes against a rough strip of sandpaper, and for one flickering second, the entire world depends on that tiny flame. There is no switch to flip. There is no glow waiting behind a wall. There is only fire, carried carefully from a matchstick to the wick of an oil lamp, and the fragile understanding that if this flame goes out, so does everything else. This is 4 o'clock in the morning, in the year 1880, somewhere in rural America, and the day has already begun. To understand what it meant to live without electricity, you have to understand what darkness actually was. Not the soft orange darkness of a modern city, dimmed by streetlights and glowing windows, but a true darkness, thick and total, broken only by starlight, moonlight, and whatever fire a person was willing to tend. In 1880, roughly 50 million people lived in the United States, and for the overwhelming majority of them, night was still night in the oldest sense of the word. It was a wall that fell over the land every evening, and it would not lift again until the sun decided to rise. The woman striking that match is likely awake before her husband, before her children, before the rooster even thinks to crow. Her name might be Sarah, or Martha, or Louisa, one of millions of women whose labor kept the household running long before anyone used the phrase full-time job. She lights the lamp, and by its small trembling light she makes her way to the kitchen, where the real work of the morning is waiting for her. The kitchen in 1880 is dominated by one object, the cast iron cookstove. It is heavy, black, and utterly essential. Unlike an electric range that heats instantly, this stove must be built up from nothing. She opens the firebox, arranges kindling she split and gathered the evening before, and strikes another match. Slowly, patiently, the fire grows. It will take the better part of an hour before that stove is hot enough to bake bread or fry salt pork. There is no thermostat here, only experience. She knows the stove is ready by the color of the coals and the way heat radiates against her palm when she holds it near the iron surface. While the fire builds, she fills a large kettle with water hauled the day before from a well or a nearby spring, because there is no faucet in this kitchen, no pipe bringing water from some unseen reservoir. Water is a substance that must be earned through physical labor, bucket by bucket, and every drop used for cooking, washing, or drinking represents someone's trip outside with a yoke across their shoulders or a rope lowered into a well. In cities, some households by this point have access to municipal water systems, a genuine luxury, but out here in farm country, water still comes from the ground the old way. As the light through the window shifts from black to deep blue, her husband rises. Let's call him Thomas. He pulls on wool trousers and a heavy cotton shirt, clothing that will need to survive a full day of physical labor because there is no washing machine waiting to make quick work of the dirt he is about to accumulate. He steps outside into air that smells of damp earth, wood smoke beginning to rise from a dozen distant chimneys, and the particular mineral scent of a world that has not yet been touched by combustion engines or industrial exhaust. The farm animals do not know or care what time modern society has agreed upon. They know light and dark, hunger and rest, and Thomas's morning routine bends entirely around their needs. He walks to the barn, lantern in hand, its small flames swinging shadows across the wooden walls. Inside, cows shift and low, already anticipating the relief of milking. He sits on a low stool, presses his forehead against the warm flank of the animal, and begins the rhythmic work of hand milking, a skill so essential that farm children were taught it almost as soon as they could grip properly. Each cow takes perhaps 10 to 15 minutes. If Thomas's farm has 6 or 8 milking cows, this single task before breakfast eats up nearly 2 hours of his morning. There is no refrigeration to preserve what he collects. The milk will be poured into shallow pans and left in the coolest part of the cellar or springhouse, where the cream can rise naturally to the top over several hours, to be skimmed off later for butter. Anything not used quickly will spoil, and so the rhythm of dairy work in 1880 is a constant negotiation with time and temperature, using cellars, springs, and sometimes ice cut from frozen ponds the previous winter and stored in sawdust-packed icehouses to slow the inevitable decay of food. Back in the house, breakfast is coming together over that same wood-fed stove. There is bacon or salt pork sizzling in a cast-iron skillet, biscuits or cornbread baking in a compartment heated entirely by the fire beneath it, and coffee made from beans that were likely roasted and ground by hand that very morning, because pre-ground coffee that stays fresh on a shelf is still decades away from being common. The children are roused from their beds, dressing quickly in the cold morning air since there is no central heating pushing warmth through hidden ducts. Whatever heat exists in this house radiates outward from two sources only, the cookstove in the kitchen and perhaps a fireplace or a parlor stove in the main living space, meaning bedrooms are often left to the mercy of the outside temperature, sometimes cold enough that water left in a basin overnight will have a thin skin of ice by morning in the winter months. By the time the family sits down to eat, the sun has properly risen, and this matters more than it might seem, because in 1880 the working day is still governed largely by daylight rather than by clocks. Some households do own a clock, often a proud mantelpiece wound carefully each night, but for millions of rural Americans, the true timekeeper is the sun's position in the sky. Farmers speak of morning chores, midday work, and evening chores rather than 9 o'clock or 5 o'clock, and an entire vocabulary of labor exists that has nothing to do with numbers on a dial. After breakfast, the day fractures into its separate, demanding paths. Thomas heads to the fields, where the technology of 1880 agriculture sits at an interesting crossroads. Mechanical improvements are beginning to appear, horse-drawn reapers, cultivators, and plows with steel blades that cut through prairie sod far more effectively than the wrought iron tools of earlier decades. Yet these machines are still powered by muscle, horse or mule or ox, not by engines. A farmer walking behind a horse-drawn plow will cover perhaps 2 acres in a full day of grueling labor, guiding the animal, correcting the furrow, wrestling with roots and rocks the plow strikes without warning. There is no cab with a seat, no shade, no radio playing to pass the hours. There is only sun, dirt, sweat, and the patient rhythm of an animal that needs rest and water just as much as the man behind it. Meanwhile, Sarah's morning inside the house has barely slowed. Monday, if this happens to be washing day, is one of the most physically brutal days of the entire week. Clothing must be scrubbed by hand against a ridged washboard in a tub of water heated on the stove, using soap that in many households is still made at home from rendered animal fat and lye, a caustic and dangerous process performed outdoors months earlier and stored for use throughout the year. Heavy, waterlogged fabric is wrung out by hand or fed through a hand-cranked wringer if the family is fortunate enough to own one, then hung on lines strung between the house and a nearby tree, where it will dry only if the weather cooperates. A single day of washing for a family of 6 or 7 people can take the entire day, leaving hands raw, knuckles scraped, and the back aching from hours bent over a tub. If it is not washing day, there are still countless other tasks. Bread must be baked, usually every few days rather than daily, since the labor of building a fire hot enough for baking is significant enough that women learn to plan ahead and bake several loaves at once. Vegetables from the garden must be picked, and depending on the season, preserved through canning, a process that itself requires standing over boiling water for extended periods to properly seal jars against spoilage. Meat, if a hog has recently been slaughtered, must be salted, smoked, or otherwise cured, since there is no freezer to simply hold it in stasis. Every single method of food preservation available to this family requires either salt, smoke, sugar, vinegar, or careful drying, techniques passed down through generations because they represent the difference between a family eating through the winter or facing genuine hunger. The children, meanwhile, are not idle. Depending on age, they might be minding younger siblings, gathering eggs from the henhouse, carrying water, feeding chickens, or if they are fortunate enough to live near a schoolhouse and the season allows it, walking sometimes several miles down a dirt road to attend a one-room school. Education in 1880 rural America is often seasonal, arranged around planting and harvest, because children's labor is too valuable to the family's survival to spare during the busiest agricultural periods. The schoolhouse itself, when it is in session, is heated by a single stove, lit by daylight through windows, and taught by often one teacher instructing students ranging from 6 years old to 16, all in the same room. Midday arrives not with a lunch break in the modern sense but with what many households simply call dinner, the largest meal of the day, eaten around noon when the sun stands highest and work pauses briefly before resuming. This meal might include whatever was cooked that morning alongside fresh additions, and for farm families, it is often eaten together as the entire household gathers for the one substantial pause in an otherwise unbroken day of labor. The afternoon continues much as the morning did, work stretching on without the artificial boundaries that clocks and electric lighting would later impose. There is no reason to stop at a specific hour because there is no evening entertainment waiting, no glowing screen, no illuminated street to wander down. Instead, the boundary that matters is the sun itself, and as it begins its descent toward the horizon, both Thomas and Sarah start thinking not about finishing up but about preparing for darkness, which brings its own entirely separate set of demands. Livestock must be fed and secured before nightfall, since predators, coyotes, foxes, sometimes wolves depending on the region, pose a genuine threat once darkness falls. Water troughs are refilled. The cows are milked again, a second time that day, because dairy cattle require milking roughly every 12 hours regardless of how tired the person doing the milking might feel. Firewood for the evening and the following morning is split and stacked near the door, since nothing is more miserable than discovering after dark that the woodpile has run dry. As the light fades toward evening, the household begins its transition into what we might call artificial illumination, though the word artificial barely applies to something as primal as fire. The kerosene lamp is the crown jewel of 1880s household lighting, having largely replaced the whale oil and tallow candles of earlier decades. Kerosene, refined from petroleum, burns brighter and cleaner than the animal fats families relied upon for generations, and by 1880 it is widely available and relatively affordable, sold in general stores across the country. Still, lamps require constant maintenance. The glass chimney must be wiped clean of soot daily, since even a thin black film will dim the light considerably. Wicks must be trimmed to prevent smoking and flickering. Oil reservoirs must be filled, a task usually done in daylight to avoid spilling flammable liquid in the dark. Candles remain in use as well, particularly for carrying light briefly from room to room, since a lit candle is far easier to transport safely than an open lamp. Many households still make their own candles at home, pouring melted tallow or beeswax into molds, a task usually reserved for autumn when animal fat is most available following the harvest slaughter of livestock. The quality of homemade candlelight varies considerably, sometimes smoky, sometimes dim, always requiring frequent replacement as the candle burns down. This matters enormously for how the evening unfolds, because light itself is a limited and precious resource. A family does not illuminate every room the way a modern household might. Instead, life concentrates around a single well-lit space, usually the kitchen or a central sitting room, where the family gathers close enough to share the light of one or two lamps. This is where the evening's remaining work happens. Sarah might be mending clothing, her needle catching lamplight as she repairs torn seams or patches worn knees on children's trousers. Thomas might be sharpening tools for the following day, oiling leather harnesses, or reading aloud from a newspaper, a Bible, or one of the relatively few books the household owns, since printed material, while more available than in earlier decades thanks to advances in printing and rail distribution, is still something of a modest luxury for many families. The evening meal, called supper, is lighter than the midday dinner, often consisting of leftovers or simple fare that requires little additional cooking, since the fire has usually been allowed to die down by this point to conserve fuel. Conversation during this time is not competing with any screen or device. It is not competing with anything at all except perhaps the crackle of the fire and the sound of wind against the windows. Families in 1880 spend their evenings talking, singing if someone in the household plays an instrument, perhaps a fiddle or a simple parlor organ if they are fortunate enough to own one, or simply sitting together in the quiet, tired satisfaction of a day's labor completed. By modern standards, the range of evening entertainment available is remarkably narrow, yet the people living through it did not experience it as deprivation, because they had never known anything else. Letter writing occupies a significant place in evening hours, since correspondence with distant family members is often the only connection to relatives who moved west or remained behind in the old country. Handwriting by lamplight, the pen scratching across paper, represents one of the few times in the day when a person might sit relatively still and think without the pressure of physical labor demanding their attention. As the evening deepens, exhaustion sets in with a weight that modern life rarely produces in quite the same way, because this exhaustion comes from an entire day of continuous physical exertion, unaided by any machine that runs on anything but muscle. Sleep in 1880 typically comes early, often not long after full darkness settles in, because tomorrow's 4 o'clock wake-up call is inevitable and unforgiving. Before bed, the lamps are extinguished one by one, their flames pinched out or blown away, the smell of hot wax or kerosene smoke lingering briefly in the air. The final task of the night often falls to Thomas, who checks that the animals are secure, that the fire in the stove has been properly banked so it will hold enough heat to be revived quickly the next morning without starting entirely from scratch, and that the doors are latched against whatever might wander close to the house in the total darkness beyond the windows. Outside, without any electric light for perhaps miles in any direction, the night sky over 1880 America reveals itself with a clarity that is almost impossible to describe to anyone who has only known artificial illumination. Thousands of stars, the pale wash of the Milky Way stretching overhead, a canopy of light so dense it seems to almost hum with presence. This was the sky every single person on Earth once knew intimately, before electricity pulled a curtain of artificial glow between humanity and the universe above it. Inside the farmhouse, the family settles into beds warmed only by quilts stitched from scraps of old fabric, layered thick enough to hold body heat through a night that might dip well below freezing depending on the season. There is no furnace humming somewhere unseen, no soft blue glow of a device charging on a nightstand, no distant hum of electricity running invisibly through walls. There is only darkness, breathing, the occasional creak of an old wooden house settling, and the deep, dreamless sleep of people who have earned every hour of rest through the sheer physical demand of simply living. This single day, repeated with only slight variation across the seasons, represents the lived reality of the vast majority of Americans in 1880. It was a life measured not in kilowatts or minutes but in daylight hours, muscle, fire, and water hauled by hand. It was a life where every convenience modern people take for granted, instant light, instant heat, instant water, instant preserved food, had to be earned through labor, planning, and skill passed down through generations. And yet within this same decade, in laboratories and workshops scattered across the country, inventors were already tinkering with filaments and circuits that would soon begin to unravel this entire way of life. Thomas Edison's incandescent bulb, first successfully demonstrated in 1879, was only just beginning its long march toward American homes, a march that would take decades to reach rural farmhouses like the one just described, but which had already started, quietly, irreversibly, in the cities. Within a single generation, children who grew up hauling water by hand and reading by kerosene lamplight would live to see electric streetlights banish the darkness from city streets entirely, electric motors replace muscle in countless tasks, and eventually, electric wires reach even the most remote farmhouses, though for many rural families that final transformation would not arrive until well into the 20th century, decades after cities had already been transformed. The day described here, the 4 o'clock wake-up, the hand-pumped water, the hours of milking, the washboard scrubbing, the kerosene lamps, the early bedtime dictated by darkness itself, would not simply fade away but would be remembered, sometimes with nostalgia, sometimes with genuine relief that it had ended, by the very people who lived it. What remains most striking, looking back from a world illuminated at the flip of a switch, is not simply how difficult that life was, though it certainly was demanding beyond what most modern people could sustain without adjustment. What remains striking is how completely ordinary it felt to those living it. There was no sense of deprivation in rising before dawn or working by the light of an open flame, because it was simply how life worked, how it had always worked, how every generation before them had lived as well. The true revolution of electricity was not merely convenience. It was the quiet, total reshaping of what an ordinary day could contain, stretching human activity into hours once reserved entirely for rest, and in doing so, rewriting the very rhythm by which human beings had measured their lives since the beginning of recorded history. The family in that farmhouse, sleeping soundly under handmade quilts beneath a sky ablaze with stars no city light would ever again allow them to fully see, had no way of knowing that the world their grandchildren would inherit would look nothing like the one they knew, lit not by fire, but by something they could barely imagine, flowing invisibly and silently through wires strung across a nation not yet ready to receive it.